Most educators know what a turn and talk is. But are your students excited to do them? In this episode, we put turn and talks under a microscope. We'll talk with Ramsey Merritt from the Harvard Graduate School of Education about ways to revamp and better scaffold turn and talks to ensure your students are having productive mathematical discussions. Welcome to the podcast, Ramsey. So great to have you on.
It is my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So turn and talk's been around for a while now, and I guess I'd call it ubiquitous at this point. When I visit classrooms, I see turn and talks happen often with quite mixed results. And I wanted to start with this question. At the broadest level, what's the promise of a turn and talk? When strategically done well, what's it good for?
I think at the broadest level, we want students talking about their thinking, and we also want them listening to other students' thinking, and ideally being open to reflect, ask questions, and maybe even change their minds on their own thinking or add a new strategy to their thinking. That's at the broadest level. I think if we were to zoom in a little bit, I think turn and talks are great for idea generation when you are entering a new concept or a new lesson or a new unit. I think they're great for comparing strategies. They're obviously great for building listening skills, with the caveat that you put structures in place for them, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, and building critical thinking and questioning skills as well. I think I've also seen turn and talks broadly categorized into engagement. And it's interesting when I read that, because to me, I think about engagement as the teacher's responsibility and what the teacher needs to do no matter what the pedagogical tool is. So no matter whether it's a turn and talk or something else, engagement is what the teacher needs to craft and create a moment. And I think a lot of what we'll probably talk about today is about crafting moments for the turn and talk. In other words, how to engage students in a turn and talk, but not that a turn and talk is automatically engagement.
I love that. And I think the language that you've used around crafting is really important. And it gets to the heart of what I was excited about in this conversation, because a turn and talk is a tool, but there is an art and a craft to designing its implementation that really can make or break the tool itself.
Yeah. If we look back a little bit as to where turn and talk came from, I sort of tried to dig into the papers on this. And what I found was that it seems as if turn and talks may have been a sort of spinoff of the think, pair, share, which has been around a little bit longer. And what's interesting in looking into this is I think that turn and talks were originally positioned as a sort of cousin of think, pair, share that can be more spontaneous and more in the moment. And I think what has happened is we've lost the think part. So we've run with it and we've said, this is great, but we forgot that students still need time to think before they turn and talk. And so what I see a lot is it gets to be somewhat too spontaneous, and certain students are not prepared to just jump into conversations. And we have to take a step back and sort of think about that.
Yeah, that really leads into my next question quite well, because I have to confess that when I've attended presentations, there are points in time when I've been asked to turn and talk when I can tell you I had not a lot of interest nor a lot of clarity about what I should do. And then there were other points where I couldn't wait to start that conversation. And I think this is the craft, and it's also the place where we should probably think about what are the pitfalls that can derail or have a turn and talk kind of lose the value that's possible. How would you talk about that?
Yeah. It is funny that we as adults have that reaction when people say turn and talk. The three big ones that I see the most, and I should sort of say here, I've probably been in 75 to 100 buildings and, triple or quadruple that for classrooms. So I've seen a lot of turn and talks, just like you said. And the three big ones for me I'll start with the one that I see less frequently, but still see it enough to cringe and want to tell you about it. And it's what I call the stall turn and talk. So it's where teachers will sometimes use it to buy themselves a little time. I have literally heard teachers say something along the lines of, okay, turn and talk to your neighbor while I go grab something off the printer. But the two biggest ones I think lead to turn and talk failure are a lack of specificity. And in that same vein, too, what are you actually asking them to discuss? So there's a bit of vagueness in the prompting. So that's one of the big ones. The other big one for me is, and it seems so simple, and I think most elementary teachers are very good at using an engaging voice. They've learned what tone does for students and what signals tone sends to them about, is now the time to engage? Should I be excited? But I so often see the turn and talk launched unenthusiastically. And that leads to an engagement deficit. And that's what you're starting out with if you don't have a good launch. Students are already sort of against you because you haven't made them excited to talk.
I mean, those things resonate. And I have to say, there are some of them that I cringe because I've been guilty of doing definitely the first thing when I've been unprepared. But I think these two that you just shared, they really go to this question of how intentionally I am thinking about building that sense of engagement and also digging into the features that make a turn and talk effective and engaging. So let's talk about the features that make turn and talks effective and engaging for students. I've heard you talk about the importance of picking the right moment for a turn and talk. So what's that mean?
So for me, I break it down into three key elements. And one of them, as you say, is the timing. And this might actually be the most important element. And it goes back to the origin story is if you ask a question and say you haven't planned a turn and talk, but you ask a question to a whole group and you see 12 hands shoot up, that is an ideal moment for a turn and talk. You automatically know that students are interested in this topic. So I think that's the sort of origin story is instead of whipping around the room and asking all 12 students, because especially at the elementary level, if students don't get their chance to share, they are very disappointed. So I've also seen these moments drag out far too long. So it's kind of a good way to get everyone's voice heard. Maybe they're not saying it out to the whole group, but they get to have everyone's voice heard. And also you're buying into the engagement that's already there. So that would be the more spontaneous version. But you can plan in your lesson planning to time a turn and talk at a specific moment if you know your students well enough that you know you can get them engaged in. And so that leads to one of the other points is the launch itself. So then you're really thinking about, okay, I think this could be an interesting moment for students. Let me think a little bit deeper about what the hook is. Almost every teacher knows what a hook is, but they typically think about the hook at the very top of their lesson. And they don't necessarily think about how do I hook students in to every part of my lesson. And maybe it's not a full 1 minute launch, maybe it's not a full hook, but you got to re-engage students, especially now in this day and time, we're seeing students with increasingly smaller attention spans. So it's important to think about how you're launching every single piece of your lesson. And then the third one, which goes against that origin story that I may or may not even be right about, but it goes against that sort of spontaneous nature of turn and talks is I think the best turn and talks are usually planned out in advance. So for me, it's planning, timing, and launching. Those are my elements to success when I'm coaching teachers on doing a turn and talk.
Another question that I wanted to unpack is talk about what? The turn and talk is a vehicle, but there's also content, right? And so I'm wondering about that. And then I'm also wondering, are there prompts or particular types of questions that educators can use that are more interesting and engaging and they help draw students in and build that engagement experience you were talking about?
Yeah, and it's funny you say talk about what, because that's actually feedback that I've given to teachers when I say, how did that go for you? And they go, well, it went okay. And I said, well, what did you ask them to talk about? Talk about what is important to think about in that planning process, right? So I hate to throw something big out there. But I would actually argue that at this point, we have seen the turn and talk sort of devolve into something that is stigmatized, that often is vague. So, what if instead of calling everything a turn and talk, you had specific types of turn and talks in your classroom? And these would take a little time to routinize. Students would have to get used to them. But one idea I had is, what if you just called one pick a side? Pick a side. It tells the students right away what they need to do. It's extremely specific. So you're giving them one or two, well, not one, you're giving them two or three strategies, and you're telling them you have to pick one of these. And you're going to be explaining to your partner your rationale as to why you think that strategy works best or most efficiently. Or maybe it's a error analysis kind of thing. Maybe you plant one in as wrong, one in as right, and then you still ask them, pick a side here. Who do you agree with? And then you also get a check for understanding, because the students around the room who are picking the wrong one, you're picking up data on what they understand about the topic. Another one you can do is, you could just call it justify your thinking. Justify your thinking. So that just simply says to them, I have to explain to the person next to me why I'm thinking the way that I'm thinking about this prompt or this problem. So that could also be like a help their thinking. So maybe you put up someone's thinking on the board that is half baked, and now their job is to help that person. So that's a sort of deeper knowledge kind of thing too. And then the last one is, we can turn the what do you notice, what do you wonder into a routine that is very similar to a turn and talk, where both people have an opportunity to share what they're wondering or what they're noticing. But I think no matter what you call them, no matter how you routinize them, I think it's important to be more specific than turn and talk.
You know, you use the word routinized. It's making me think a lot about why we find routines to have value, right? Because once you teach a particular routine, kids know what it is to do said routine. They know what it is to show up when you're doing which one doesn't belong. They know the role that they play. And I think part of what really jumps out is, if you had a series of more granular turn and talk experiences that you were trying to cultivate, kids actually have a sense of what it is to do a turn and talk if you are helping thinking, or if you are agreeing or disagreeing, or whatever the choice might be.
That's right. For me, everything, even when I'm working with middle and high school teachers, I say the more that you can put structures in place that remove those sort of barriers for thinking, the better off you're going to be. And so we could talk more too about how to differentiate and scaffold turn and talk, because sometimes that gets forgotten as well. But I think the other piece I would love to point out here is around, you're right, turn and talk is so ubiquitous. And what that means, what I've seen in schools, I'll go into a school and I might watch 4 different teachers teach the same lesson, and the turn and talk will look and feel differently in each room. So the other advantage to being more specific is that if a student, let's say they went to, because even in an elementary school, you might go to a specialist, like you might go to art class, and that teacher might use a turn and talk, right? And what happens is they sort of get this general idea around the turn and talk, and then they come into your room with whatever the turn and talk was in the last class, or however the teacher used it last year. So to me, there's also a benefit in personalizing it to your room as well, so that you can get rid of some of that stigma if it wasn't going well for the student before, especially if you then go in and scaffold it.
Let's talk a little bit about those scaffolds, and maybe dig in a little bit deeper to some of the different kinds of routinized turn and talks. I'm wondering if you want to unpack anything in particular that you think would really be important for a teacher to think about as they're trying to take up the ideas that we've been discussing.
Yeah, and one of the simplest ones to implement is the partner A, partner B routine. I think maybe many of your listeners will be like, yeah, I use that. But one of the pieces that's really important there is that you really hold students accountable to honoring partner A's time, right? So when partner A is speaking, partner B needs to be trying to make, not everybody can do the eye contact thing, but there are some things that you can recommend and suggest for them. Maybe they have something to take notes on, right? So this could be having whiteboards at your rug. It could be clipboards. It could be that they have a turn and talk thought catcher notebook or folder. And it doesn't matter what it is, but not everyone has the same processing skills, right? So we think about turn and talk sometimes as spontaneous, but we're forgetting that 12 students raised their hand and they were eager. What about the other 12 or 15? If they didn't raise their hand, it could be that they're shy, but they have something on their mind. But it also could be that you just threw out a prompt and they haven't fully processed it yet. We know kids process things at different times and at different speeds. So incorporating in that, maybe it's even a minute up top. Everybody's taking their silent and solo minute to think about this prompt, then partner A is going to go. It's about equity and voice across the room. It's about encouraging listening. It's about giving think time.
Well, I want to stop and mark a couple things. What occurs to me is that in some ways, a podcast interview like this is one long turn and talk in the sense that you and I are both listening and talking with one another. And as you were talking, one of the things I realized is I didn't have a piece of paper with me, and how what you were saying really connects deeply, because even if it's just jotting down a word or two to help me remember, like that was a salient point, or this is something that I want to follow up on, that's really critical. Otherwise, it really can feel like it can evaporate, and then you're left kind of not being able to explore something that might have been really important. I think the other thing that jumps out is the way that this notion of having a notepad or something to jot is actually a way to not necessarily just privilege spoken communication, right? That if I'm going to process or if I'm going to try to participate, having something like that might actually open up space for a kid whose favorite thing to do isn't to talk and process as they're talking. Does that make sense?
Totally. I had a student in a program I was working with this summer who was 13 years old, but was selectively mute. And the student teachers who were working in this room wanted to still be able to do a turn and talk. And they had her still partner with people, but she wrote down sentences and she literally held up her whiteboard. And then the other student responded to the sentence that she wrote down on her whiteboard. So that's real. And to your other point about being able to jot down so you can remember, yeah, we have to remember we're talking about 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds. We're fully functioning adults and we still need to jot things down. So imagine when your brain is not even fully developed, we can't expect them to remember something from when they haven't been allowed to, interrupt the other. And so I think going on now, what you're saying is that then makes me think about the partner A, partner B thing could also sort of tamper down the excitement a little bit if you make another student wait. So you also have to think about maybe that time in between, you might need to re-engage. Just that's my own thinking right now, evolving as we're talking.
So in some ways, this is a nice segue to something else that you really made me think about. When we were preparing for this interview, much of what I was thinking about is the role of the teacher in finding the moment, as you said, where you can build excitement and build engagement, or thinking about the kind of prompts that have a specificity and how that could impact the substance of what kids are talking about. But what really jumped out from our conversation is that there's also a receptive side of turn and talk, meaning that there are people who are talking, but we also don't want the other person to just be passive, right? What does it look like to support the listening side of turn and talk? And I would love it if you would talk about the kinds of things you think it's important for educators to think about when they're thinking about that side of turn and talk.
I would say don't forget about sentence starters that have to do with listening. So often when we're scaffolding, we're thinking about how do I get them to share out? How do I get them to be able to address this prompt? But one of the easiest scaffolds that I've heard for listening, and it works very, very well, is the what I heard you say is blank. And so then the receptive student knows that A tells them they have to be listening pretty carefully because they're about to be asked to repeat what the other person said. And this is an age-old elementary school sort of piece of pedagogy, is a call and response situation. But then we want to give them a stem that allows them maybe to ask a question. So it's what I heard you say was blank. What I'm wondering is blank. So that takes it to the next thinking level. But again, it's about being really specific and very intentional with your students and saying, when it's partner B's turn, you must lead with what I heard you say is, and only then can you get to your thinking or asking questions.
That's huge. I think, particularly when you think about the fact that there may be status issues between partner A and partner B. You know, if partner A is seen as or sees themselves as someone who's good at math, and that's less true for partner B, the likelihood of actually listening in a productive way seems like it's in danger at the very least. So I see these as tools that really do, one, build a level of kind of accountability, responsibility, but also level the playing field when it comes to things like status between two students.
I would agree with that. Yeah. I think too, we always want to be mixing our groups. I think sometimes you get, when I think about those sort of people or those students who, you can walk into any classroom and you right away can look around the room. If you've seen enough math teaching, you can see the students who have the most confidence in math. So another piece to sort of leveling that field is making sure that your turn-in talks are not always built on skill or high-level conceptual understanding, right? So that's where it might be helpful to have a more low-floor task, like a what do you notice? What do you wonder? But using the turn-in talk routine of that. So it gives people more of a chance to get involved even when they don't have the highest level. It's kind of like the same idea with a which one doesn't belong or a typical number talk. But so you as the teacher have to be thinking about, okay, yesterday we did one that was comparing two people's strategies, and I know that some of my students didn't quite understand either one of them. So today, in order to rebuild some of that confidence, I might do a version of a turn-in talk that is much more open to different kinds of thinking.
You know, you started to go there in this last conversation we had about supporting the receptive side of turn and talk. I did want to ask if we can go a little bit deeper and think about tools like anchor charts, and you already mentioned sentence prompts, but sentence frames. To what extent do you feel like those can be helpful in building the kinds of habits we're talking about? And do you have any thoughts about those or any other resources that you think are important scaffolds?
Yeah, I have seen some really, really wonderful teachers bring in such a simple way of activating an anchor chart. And that is, especially, it's easier to do in inquiry-based learning, but I think you can do it in any kind of classroom, is when a student presents their thinking early on in a unit, and let's say we're talking about comparing fractions. And they say, this is how I compared fractions. And you're annotating and you're charting it up for them as the teacher. You can call that strategy Maya's strategy, right? And so now it has a little bit more stickiness for both the students and for you. Now, you know that there's a specific mathematical name for that strategy, but the students don't necessarily need to know that. You could put it in parentheses if you want, but I have seen that be really effective. And I've actually heard other students go, I'm going to use Maya's strategy for this one and be able to then look and reference it. I think what happens sometimes with the anchor charts is we still live in a sort of Pinterest world, and some people want those anchor charts to be beautiful, but they're not actually useful because it was drawn up perfectly and it's lovely and it's pretty, but the students don't have a real connection to it. So the other piece to that is the co-creation of the anchor chart. So it's not just naming the student, it's also going through it step by step. Maybe they're leading through it. Maybe you're guiding it. Maybe you're asking probing questions. Maybe you throw in a turn-in talk in the middle of that sort of exploration. And then students have a connection to that piece of paper. Anchor charts that have been created during your prep period, I guarantee you, will have very little effect. So that's how I feel about those. I also love, I call them like mini anchor charts, but they sit on tables. In recent years, I've seen more and more, especially in elementary classrooms, and I've encouraged them at the middle school and the high school level, of putting in a little I don't really know the best way to describe it for listeners, but it sits on the tabletop and it's almost like a placard holder. And inside of that, you put a mini version of an anchor chart that sits at the students' tables. So if you're doing turn and talks at their desk and they're sitting in desks of 4, and that's right there in front of them with some sentence starters or maybe your very specific routines, pick a side. And then you have the 3 steps to picking a side underneath. If that's sitting on the table right in front of them, they are much more likely to reference it than if it's on the wall across the room. That gets a little trickier if you're down at the rug, if you're doing turn and talks down at the rug. But hey, you can get a slightly bigger one and stick a few down on the rug around them too if you really need to.
I love that. That seems powerful and yet eminently practical.
I've seen it work.
Well, this happens to me every time I do a podcast. I have a lovely conversation and we get close to the end of it. And I find myself asking, for listeners, what recommendations do you have for people who either want to learn more or would like to get started implementing some of the ideas we discussed today?
Sure. I mean, the biggest one that I tell both new teachers and veterans when you're looking to sort of improve on your practice is to go watch someone else teach. So it's as simple as asking a colleague, hey, do you know anybody who does this really well? In fact, I've led some PDs at schools where I've said, who in the room is great at this? And a few people will throw their hands up and I go, great, instead of me explaining it, I'm going to have you tell us why you're so successful at that. So the easiest one is to go watch someone who has this down, right? But for some of the things that I've mentioned, I would think about not biting off too much. So if you are someone who your turn and talks, you readily admit that they're not specific, they're not fully routinized, and they don't go well for you, I would not recommend putting in 4 new routines tomorrow, the A-B partner thing, and making the anchor charts for the tables all at once. What I always say is try one thing and also be transparent with the students. It goes a really long way, even with 7-year-olds, when you say, all right, guys, we're going to do a new version of the turn and talk today because I've noticed that some of you have not been able to share as much as I would like you to. So we're going to try this, which is, for me, I hope it allows both people to share. And afterwards, you can let me know how that felt. Students really appreciate that gesture, and I think that's really important if you are going to try something new to sort of be transparent about it. Oftentimes when teachers implement something new, it can feel like not a punishment, but it's almost like ooh, why is she changing this up on us? So letting them know also creates a warmer space too, and it shows them that you're learning, you're growing.
I love that, and I think that's a great place to stop. Ramsey, thank you so much. It has really been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Like you said, I could do it all day. So I really appreciate it. I wish everyone out there well, and thanks again.
This podcast is brought to you by the Math Learning Center and the Meyer Math Foundation, dedicated to inspiring and enabling all individuals to discover and develop their mathematical confidence and ability.